Hi guys, today we're going to talk about a different social change theory. In fact, it's one of my favorites and one you'll see commonly applied in many debates, be it on a community level or nation level or even international level change, and that is whether change should be top down or change should be bottom up, right? So let's briefly discuss the philosophy and then we'll look at a couple of debates where this can apply. So what is this top-down, bottom-up change? It's very simple. Society is always organized in some kind of hierarchy, right? So at the top of this hierarchy are people with more power, that's not how you spell power. People with more power, people with more money, right? And less people have these things. But they also depend on the support of the people at the bottom. So regardless if you are a corporate leader or a political figure or anybody, you need the support of the people at the bottom in order to stay at the top, right? So how do you translate ideas? Should the idea come from the top down to the bottom, right? And this could be even if I was trying to organize like a campaign, let's say, right? Or should it be from the bottom and then the change filters up to the top, right? Those are the different approaches. Now, if a society is very organized, is great infrastructure and systems, has a lot of respect for authority, then a top-down approach works really well, right? So if it's top-down, I'll use a different color here. If it is organized, if there's respect for authority, not always a good thing, respect for authority, sometimes a good thing. If it is very efficient, right? So it's an efficient company, an efficient organization, an efficient country, government, top-down change works really well, right? But if you don't have these things, then if people don't respect authority, if there's not an efficient delivery system, for example, then your top-down change is unlikely to happen, right? Or in situations where you have a lot more diversity, right? So many different people, different groups, different communities, then bottom-up change works better. If you have, if the people here are like disorganized or separated, then you need a kind of more bottom-up approach. If you're not sure which approach works in which situation, right? Then you need more diverse solutions, then you need a more bottom-up approach, right? Rather than have a top-down, one-size, blanket-fits-all approach, okay? So those are the different frameworks. Now, which one of this is true and which one of this works? It depends again on that context, what exactly this picture looks like. So is the company or the country more integrated? Is the government really efficient or not efficient, right? The truth is always somewhere in the middle, but it's really up to you to paint that context. And if you can efficiently paint the context, then you have all these, then your philosophy will work. Okay? So that's the idea with top-down versus bottom-up. There'll be some classic arguments you use on either approach, but it will still come down to the context as it almost always does. Let's look at some arguments, right? Or well, not arguments, rather, not yet arguments. We'll look at some debates. So there are three debates here, which I think are relevant to this philosophy. The first one is, this house would ban speech that offends religion. Secondly, this house would give aid directly to communities instead of the government. And thirdly, this house would sanction religious organizations that do not recognize gender equality. So the first one is really a debate about how to change society and whether or not legislation is an effective way of changing society, right? So it is a free speech debate, whether or not offending is good or bad and should allow it, not allow it. But it's more about how, whether or not this legislation works. If you want to have a society with low offensiveness and good things, and good things in terms of like a norm, right? Because this is a speech norm. You're not talking about whether killing people is good or bad, but whether kind of behavior is good or bad in society, then is it a good way to have that top-down driven, or is it better to make some changes at the bottom and then that filters up to the top? Okay, so that's the top-down framework. in opposition to this, you can say that, oh, I don't think, this is bad, that I don't think that, offending religion is good and everybody should offend it, but I think the change should be bottom up, not top down, right? And that will provide a nice philosophical opposition to this motion. The second thing is also a classic top-down versus bottom-up approach, giving aid directly to communities instead of the government. And this depends a lot on your characterization of the government and the communities, right? So how efficient and effective are they? If the government is really effective and can do something, should it be coming down from the government to the communities? Or if the communities are very diverse and different, maybe you should go from the communities to the government. It's also about what leads to a better, interactive situation at the end, and how that aid not just benefits the most number of people, but how that aid will shape the community or shape the government in the long run, right? So that's a classic kind of top-down versus bottom-up. Should the help come from the top and filter to the bottom, or from the bottom and go up to, well, not necessarily the top, but everywhere else. Thirdly, the third one is a little bit more like the first one, more than just because it says, religion. It's about how do you, whether legislation creates that change, or whether it is changing attitudes and empowering individuals, or whether the change comes from within. If you give people all this opportunity, they will change, right? So should you sanction them and then force the change from the top, or do you let the change happen from the bottom? Okay. Now, in a lot of these debates, often, or in societies, you will see both of these things happening. You need to have popular movements and people will have awareness on a societal grassroots level. And when that hits a tipping point, then the government will legislate something, right? Or you use the courts to legislate something to create that social change. Because if without some of these laws, the change becomes, it's intangible and it could go away. And the laws help people organize around those things and push for more change. Okay. So in a debate, it isn't always like only one or never the other. It is about, are we ready yet? At which point in the change we are, which points in the change are we now? And which one of these things would you rather invest in? Which one of these things do you think has more value, right? So if I had 20% of political capital, assuming I could isolate that, would I throw it behind the bottom-up social movement-driven approach, a community-driven, grassroots-driven approach, because I think it's more sustainable, because I think it's more diverse or something? Or will I throw it at the top and say we need this top-down approach because the problem is really urgent, so it needs to act fast. I have enough awareness that's already done, that's ready. You need to affect more people, quickly. So I need to have this top-down approach, right? So that's the kind of basic trade-off, which I hope you can see in these debates and in many others. Let's look into the detail of one debate, and I've chosen this one today, and that is this House would give aid directly to communities instead of the government, right? 8 debates, great debates for top-down versus bottom-up approaches. And this can apply, not just on a country level, but even just within smaller communities level, to who gets to choose what to do with aid money or with political power or whatever it is, who makes better decisions, and whether that decision making should be more organized or more dispersed, right? So in terms of the setup or definition, I don't think there's really that much detail you need to go into. You want to take a broad approach, right? Where you can talk about countries, obviously, where that aid is necessary, right? So the type of aid, I think, really doesn't matter this much in this debate. But you can talk about money, you can talk about anything, but aid that can be used by more people more freely, right? Especially if you're saying, let's give it to many different communities. It's hard if your aid was like a giant bridge, because maybe not all communities need a giant bridge or even a small bridge for that matter, right? But you're obviously going to talk about communities that need aid. Now, from a government perspective or a government team perspective, it helps you if the government that you're talking about is more inefficient. If the government is kind of broken and damaged, you cannot and should not pick a country that does not have a functioning government, because then it becomes a little truistic, tautological, right? I can't give it to a government. If a government doesn't exist, you are doing trade-offs, right? And if you pick a country that is so bad and so broken that you don't really have a functioning government, then most likely the community is also going to be a little bit problematic, okay? So you approach this from a more philosophical principle level, not just feasibility of whether the government can or cannot do it. You might even want to say that we don't care. Even if the government can, we think it's better to give it to the communities, right? So choose a place with many different communities, and it serves you better if the country is well functioning, because then you can trust the communities and give it to those communities. This is a nice stance that I think it's nice, that I want to use for this debate, and that is that stronger communities lead to stronger governments. You see, what I'm trying to do here is I'm not trying to completely remove the role of government. I think that you need to have a community first, and that leads to positive government. Because I want to avoid this kind of long-term society falls apart and, you know, you have autonomy and people maybe seek independence and break away. I don't really want to defend that. I think the whole country can still function together as one. But in order to be strong as one, the bottom parts, the grassroots, small communities need to be strong and independent and recognize some differences within them, right? And I think also this approach of wanting to stay together eventually, making a strong government, will reduce the resistance you will get from the central authority, from the government, and make it more likely that it will be cooperative and allow the aid in the first place. Okay, so that's in terms of the setup. Here are some arguments. I got 4 arguments this time, a little bit of bonus, because I like you guys. The first one is that communities know best, and I want to encourage some independence. Secondly, I think this approach is more sustainable. It's slower approach, but it's permanent, right? Doing stuff from the bottom up. Thirdly, I think it leads to more diverse society overall, and many more paths to happiness, and that's better. And finally, I think that, and this is where I'm going to say it helps government, good ideas can filter up, can improve the government at the end of the day, right? So everybody wins, it's win-win. Firstly, communities know best. This is where my characterization of the situation will help. I'll say society is diverse, some rich communities, poor communities, different ethnic groups, people in different parts of the country, they have different needs. It's better to give the aid directly to them and skip the government, right? Because then the government doesn't need to kind of filter it down to them and figure out what they need. You help that community on directly, right? But I'm saying in the long run, I think it also encourages independence, because I want communities to help themselves, right? I want them to believe that they need to do things for their own, because it's their problems, their solutions. I don't want them to be dependent on the government in the long run. I always believe that the government knows best and the government will fix our problems. No, I want to encourage the idea that communities know best and communities can fix the problems, right? So this is a very common kind of argument that you run whenever you do a bottom-up approach, right? The second thing is also kind of a common argument, which is about sustainability. If change comes from the community, if it's about shifting attitudes, encouraging independence, and you see this argument a lot when you talk about campaigns or legislation, if the individuals believe that this is the right thing, and it's not that the law makes you do it, then you're going to do it whether or not there is a law, right? And in this aid debate, you say, like, if the communities decide among themselves what the aid is to be used for, it's more likely that they will accept that decision. It's more likely they'll be committed to helping it happen because it's their own decision. They can't blame the central government for doing something good or bad. It's their own, right? Now, it may take a bit longer because maybe they're not that professional, or maybe they need to discuss and they need to think about it, but it's going to be more permanent, okay? And it will lead to more sustainable change, right? So this is a very common argument you use whenever you do a bottom-up change approach. Fourth, I will argue that it leads to more diverse societies overall, that there are many more paths to happiness, because different communities are going to decide to use their aid in different ways and come up with different approaches, right? So community A decides to do one thing, community B decides to do another thing, community C decides to do another thing, right? Whatever it is, but all together, they still live within the larger society. and different ideas can, different people will do different things, and that's better. So it's not like the central government decides all this aid needs to be used for hospitals or for internet or for education. Maybe the communities decide what they want to do, and that I think is a better form of society, right? Finally, from this idea, you connect to the government. How can this help the government? If the government doesn't try to destroy these communities, and we're assuming that they are not, and if they argue that they are, then that also helps your case, because if the government is trying to destroy the communities, the government shouldn't be getting aid money. But if they aren't, when these ideas are really successful, they can filter up, right? They can share with each different community, or they can be used for the entire country. And that's a very successful outcome or side benefit of having a federalist model, because the different communities or states or cities end up being testing grounds, right? So you try a new policy in this place and it works out, and then you can use it in many other places rather than trying to implement it in one place altogether. Okay, so that's another huge benefit of taking a bottom-up approach, right? So generally in the bottom-up world, you like the diversity, more different stuff is better. You're okay with things being slower a little bit, but you think that's more permanent. You want more long-term sustainability. Yeah, that's your kind of your bottom-up approach. Okay, now let's move to the top-down in opposition. So in top-down, you want to give direct aid, well, not aids, don't give aids. You want to give aid directly to the communities, directly to the government instead of the community. Your approach in op is two things. One, you think that you want to create more urgency, right? You think that even if the government is, not as diverse, they're going to pick things and decide things for people. This will happen faster. It'll be more urgent. They'll do it more quickly, right? It's always faster. From one distribution point, I spread out to many others, rather than I ask each one independently what you want to do, and then you think about it, and then you decide, and you move on. So I think that development will be much faster for everybody. And this part I think is important, and here too, to improve the government, right? Because I think I'm more of like a central power kind of guy. I want different people to have different opinions, but at the end of the day, we're all kind of tied in, and the only way that we can stay together, united for the long run, is to build a strong government. Okay, so that's going to be the opposition position. We think those countries that give aid need to work with the government, and also the communities need to work with the government. And that will encourage the government to care more about the communities and make the government more powerful, sustainable, effective, etc., in the long run. Let's look at the arguments. Number one, it's faster, right? So I mentioned this earlier. Even minimum government infrastructure will make a much faster delivery mechanism for aid and help more people. Secondly, it'll be more consistently implemented and organized. And this is another classic argument with top-down, and that is consistency. The criticism is that it's a blanket one-size-fits-all approach, but the pro is that what is one size and fits all is, well, pretty cool if it is actually one size and fits everybody, right? And it's consistent and impacts everybody the same way, and that's what makes it awesome. Thirdly, the government has a big picture, and we need to trust the government to help those who need help the most so they can selectively distribute the aid. And finally, this will remove the trust in the government and why that's bad in the long run, right? So let's go through them in detail. So number one, it's faster. Now, the other side may say that, look, there are problems with the government, and you should concede that this is not a perfect government. If it was a perfect government, this country wouldn't need aid, right? So the country does need aid. But even in a much less broken kind of, weak, handicapped a little bit government, it's still a government. It still has access to government infrastructure. It still has coordination points all around the country. It still has a staff and a bureaucracy. It still has control, information, and systems. So that will still make a difference, right? If they say the government can't even do that, then it's much less likely you'll have really strong, independent communities. Although sometimes you have a trade-off. When the government's really, really weak, people tend to take matters into their own hands. But for an op, you want to say that even a weak government will give you some advantages, and then argue why those advantages are really important. So it helps you in op to discuss a sense of urgency. You say that regardless of what this aid is, like if it's healthcare, education, whatever, we need these decisions to be made quickly, and the faster they're made, the more you can help people. It takes time to build a school or a hospital. It takes time to initiate policies, and those policies can need, many additional other like policies, and we need to do those things quickly. This is not a humanitarian crisis debate, although if it is, it helps you more because that becomes even more urgent, right? But you can argue how things like healthcare and education are super urgent and tend to be things that everybody wants anyway, and governments then can do it and they'll do it better, okay? Secondly, is also kind of government does it better, but the consistently implemented and organized, right? So there are two things here. One is the benefits of consistency. And if it's consistent, everybody goes through the same experience. And if these are big principal things, then the whole country can develop together. And that consistent implementation is good. It stops competition between these different communities. And that's great. And that's really, really helpful, right? But secondly, this consistency also leads to efficiency. If I reduce the diversity overhead. Diversity overhead is because things are different, you need to do each thing independently. But if I'm doing the same thing, I can get scale. I can do things. I can do more for less, right? If I build 10 schools together, I can do it more efficiently. I can also add on more policy around it that supports the building and functioning of those schools. So I won't just build schools. I can create government laws that make sure students have to go to school, right? I can do create a campaign and put stuff on TV and do all these other things, and therefore extend the impact of this policy far greater than if it was just one community building a school. Okay, so you talk about then that benefit of that government. Now, keep in mind, again, people are going to tell you that the government is dodgy. Government is dodgy, but we'll get to that when we get towards the end and the last part of this. And that's why I put in the stance that this creates stronger governments. Okay, because you always want to, even if you concede that the government's dodgy, you not working with them is going to make them even more dodgy. And they need to have at least some basic government. So it's better to always work with them in order to translate them, right? So this is coming back a little bit to what we discussed before. Remember that exclusive clash. You think that even if the government's a little bit dodgy, we want to take an inclusive approach and work with them because in the long run, that's better. But let's not get carried away. Thirdly, here's the big picture stuff. So you say that you have to trust the government to an extent, and from one central position. At the end of the day, this is still an elected, appointed government with representatives everywhere, and they can see the big picture, right? How would a foreign donor better understand where aid is most needed? You need the person at the top to be able to see everything and then make that decision, right? And that's why the top-down approach is more effective, and you can properly not isolate, send, delegate aid, and use it in the most appropriate place. Last but not least, this is where you get to that long-term building government thing, that if you do this, it sends a terrible message that people shouldn't trust the government. And trust in government is only going to go down. And that's a problem. That leads to more conflict, right? That leads to less practical, effective government. So in the long run, if you want to create a strong government, you need to work with the government, not against the government, right? And this is you supporting the hierarchy. So this is you saying that society has this kind of structure, and what we need in these forming societies is this structure, right? And to maintain the structure, work with the people at the top to help them at the bottom. And if you help the people at the bottom only, what's going to happen is you're going to break the structure. And you're going to create smaller communities. And those communities then are going to fall apart, right? And that could be really problematic. Okay? So that's your top-down approach. You must give up a little bit of diversity and differences, right? You're not talking about authoritarian governments. You say that government still needs to consult people. You can make this conditional, on anything, but they also have like an interest in doing it, because if the programs don't work out, then they don't really get any more aid and they lose legitimacy, right? Assuming the basic things that governments need to survive. Again, not perfect governments, but even half decent governments want these things. If the government wants that, then they will use it with some kind of trust and still end up working a much better top-down approach, right? You talk about why that top-down approach is faster, it's more effective, more streamlined, and can lead to more consistency, and why this consistency can be good, right? So if the context is more urgent, it will help the top-down approach. It pick on problems or issues that can be used in many different areas rather than ones that require more diversity. And obviously you take the opposite approach when you're doing a bottom-up, right? So a classic frame, top-down versus bottom-up. I hope you can recognize these debates, number one. But number two, get these classic arguments and, use them. Of course, the more you know about the specific issue, the better. But the more you can use this frame, the less thinking you have to do about some of these classic arguments, okay? So, happy top-downing and bottom-upping.